By the summer of 1945, the German POW camps located far from the former front lines began to change. Places that for years had operated strictly according to military order now echoed with new words: relocation, repatriation, verification, transit. In the barracks where winter had been endured, to the sound of creaking beams and stuttering stoves, the conversations increasingly turned to one question: when they would finally be sent home. Among the prisoners were thousands of German women held in captivity under a variety of circumstances. Many had served not as combatants but as auxiliary personnel, telephone operators, clerks, typists in headquarters, medical assistants in field hospitals, translators, administrative staff. Many had been assigned to travel with military units abroad and eventually became stranded when the front collapsed or when their garrison surrendered. Their capture was rarely the result of direct fighting. More often it happened in mass capitulations of isolated or encircled units. By the time active combat halted, life inside the camps settled into a slow, heavy rhythm. Committees arrived to register prisoners, verify their wartime roles, and investigate potential involvement in crimes. For most women in auxiliary positions, such evaluations passed relatively quickly, though they still remained behind barbed wire for months afterward. Above all, their lives were shaped by waiting. Morning roll calls, food distribution, assigned camp duties, occasional medical checks. All these routine processes filled the days, but gave no sense of forward motion. And in the evenings, behind the dim light of the barracks, memories of the pre-war world resurfaced. The quiet streets of familiar towns, white curtains in warm kitchens, the smell of bakery bread in the early mornings, tram schedules that once seemed an ordinary part of life. Information about Germany came in fragments. Sometimes newspapers reached the camp, reporting on the capitulation, the division into occupation zones, reconstruction plans. Maps appeared on administrative walls marked with new borders. From guards' conversations or passing announcements, the women learned that many cities had suffered devastating destruction, that transportation networks lay in ruins, that millions of people were searching for one another amid the rubble. But their imaginations stubbornly held on to the hope that somewhere beyond the front lines and destroyed railways their hometowns still existed. In their minds, the streets remained intact, the houses still stood, the family photos were still tucked away in drawers. This idea of home was what sustained them through the long, uncertain months in captivity. For many, it was the only stable point in a world that had collapsed. The first repatriation lists appeared suddenly. They were pinned onto wooden boards near the commandant's office or read aloud during formation. Next to each name was the region or city to which the person would be transported. Those who found their names experienced a complex mixture of relief, anxiety, and disbelief. Repatriation itself was not immediate. Groups needed to be formed, paperwork completed, transport arranged. The journey home usually consisted of several stages: the camp, a transit point, a temporary holding center, then, if lucky, a railway line or river port where people were redirected by region. At each stage, there were long waits, crowded rooms, queues for food and identification checks. But the direction toward home overshadowed these hardships. One such group of women prepared for departure consisted of former auxiliary personnel from various regions of Germany. Some came from the industrial Ruhr, others from northern port cities, still others from small towns along the Rhine or Danube. They shared not only similar wartime roles, but also a common experience: years of total disconnection from home. Letters had stopped arriving long ago, addresses had changed, relatives had been evacuated or drafted. Now, with the promise of return, each woman attempted to reconstruct the route to her city. They recalled street names, bridge locations, the layout of marketplaces. Before their inner eyes rose familiar buildings, the school of their childhood, the fabric shop on the corner, the church whose bells set the rhythm of their Sundays. These images contained almost no trace of war. The mind refused to fill the streets with ruins. The first stage of their journey took several days. They traveled in freight wagons fitted with benches and straw, receiving hot broth when the train stopped. It was difficult, but manageable, far easier than the forced marches or chaotic retreats they had once endured. As the train moved closer to Germany, the landscape became more recognizable. Fields shaped by familiar farming patterns, distinctive styles of village houses, the silhouettes of small stations, and with recognition came something else: visible destruction. At major railway hubs, the women saw charred remains of freight trains, broken tracks, collapsed roofs of station halls. In the distance, they could sometimes make out the outlines of ruined city blocks still blackened by fire. From overheard conversations, they caught repeated phrases: entire districts wiped out, no housing left, severe reconstruction needed. But memory again pushed these images aside. Each woman still clung to the assumption that her own street had somehow survived, that her home stood among the ruins like a single remaining island. The idea that everything familiar could have vanished seemed too heavy to accept. That fragile hope remained with them until the procession reached the German border. As the train slowed, a new and unsettling thought settled over the group that the word home might no longer refer to anything solid, that returning might mean arriving to nothing. And with that quiet fear, they entered the next stage of their journey, the one that would finally confront them with what their cities had truly become. The second stage of the journey took the women deeper into the interior of post-war Germany, where rail lines had only recently been cleared enough to allow limited movement. At first, the signs of destruction appeared sporadically: a damaged barn, a collapsed bridge, the remains of a single burned-out warehouse beside the tracks. But with each passing hour, the fragments of ruin grew more frequent, forming a continuous chain that stretched across the horizon. The women watched through narrow openings in the wooden freight car, their faces framed by winter coats and scarves. What they saw did not match the images preserved in their minds. Train stations built in ornate 19th century styles now stood as hollow shells, their roofs torn away, their walls stripped to skeletal beams. Storage yards, once filled with coal and timber, lay abandoned, their contents scattered or buried beneath mounds of debris. For some time, the passengers tried to persuade themselves that these were isolated cases, remnants of a front that had passed quickly. But as they entered larger towns, it became clear that the devastation had been neither brief nor selective. Entire blocks had collapsed inward, leaving fields of rubble where streets had once intersected. Chimneys jutted out of the wreckage like blackened markers, and amid the shattered stone and brick lay twisted tram tracks that had once carried workers and school children across familiar routes. The women exchanged glances, but avoided lingering too long on one another's expressions. None of them wanted to reveal how deeply the sight disturbed them. Up to this point, their idea of home had been shaped by memory, but the landscapes unfolding around them were breaking that memory apart. No one yet understood the scale of what awaited them, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. At one of the temporary transit stations, the women disembarked briefly. The platform was uneven, patched with boards where the original planks had been destroyed. A small group of Allied personnel coordinated the movement of repatriates, directing them toward waiting areas or makeshift shelters built from repurposed storage sheds. Smoke drifted from metal barrels used as heaters. The air held the sharp smell of burned wood, mixed with damp stone. Nearby, a cluster of civilians stood in line for food rations. Their coats were worn, and their faces carried the exhaustion of long months spent in uncertain conditions. Some leaned heavily on walking sticks. Others kept children close, shielding them from the cold wind that whipped across the yard. It was here, in this mixture of movement and stillness, that the women began to sense how dramatically civilian life had changed. Germany was no longer the nation they had left behind. It had become a patchwork of survival efforts, provisional structures, and temporary routines. After a short rest, the women were ushered into another rail car. The train moved slowly, stopping often to wait for clearance along damaged routes. Piles of rubble lined the tracks. Workers with shovels and pickaxes tried to clear pathways where collapsed walls blocked access. Occasionally, a signalman appeared in a makeshift booth fashioned from corrugated metal, guiding the train forward with hand signals rather than working lights. As the train approached one of the larger cities, a name familiar to several women in the group, the scale of destruction escalated dramatically. The outskirts showed rows of houses with their roofs torn off, windows shattered, and interiors exposed to the elements. Laundry lines hung between ruined walls as civilians attempted to recreate some semblance of domestic life among the wreckage. The closer they moved to the center, the more complete the devastation became. Major avenues had turned into broad channels of broken masonry. Former administrative buildings were hollowed out, their upper floors having collapsed into the lower ones. The women stared silently, unable to match the images before them with the vibrant cities they remembered. They saw no intact storefronts, no recognizable landmarks, only fractured outlines that hinted at what once stood. Some of them instinctively searched for specific points: a clock tower, a church spire, a bridge, anything that could anchor memory in the present. Yet even these familiar symbols had changed. Towers had been reduced to stumps, bridges severed into jagged fragments. Squares where markets once bustled now stood as empty expanses filled with debris. The train continued beyond the ruined city, but the shock lingered. If this place, once a significant regional center, had been reduced to such a state, what could they expect of smaller towns? What remained of their own neighborhoods, their own streets? The earlier worries that had surfaced near the border now settled into something heavier and more concrete. Late in the afternoon, the women reached another distribution point, where they were divided into smaller groups according to region. They walked along paths marked by hastily placed signs, avoiding the deep puddles that collected in the bomb craters. Wooden planks served as substitutes for sidewalks. A few temporary shelters stood nearby, patched together from canvas and salvaged boards. In this temporary camp, the women waited once more, each with her own internal landscape of memories and fears. Some sat on their luggage, others remained standing, too restless to be still. The silence between them was not the silence of strangers, but of people confronting the same realization, that the path ahead led not simply to home, but to the remnants of whatever home might still exist. Though none of them yet knew the full extent of what awaited them, the journey thus far had already reshaped their expectations. The map in their minds, once filled with familiar streets and stable structures, had begun to fade, replaced by the uncertain contours of a country rebuilding itself from ruins. Their return was no longer a return to what had been. It had become an encounter with what was left. The final stage of the women's journey took place not in trains or transit stations, but on foot, along shattered streets that no longer resembled anything from their memories. After being divided by region, each small group was escorted toward what remained of their respective towns. For many, the path began with walking along former main roads, now bordered by piles of rubble. The sound of their boots against loose stone echoed in the empty spaces where buildings had once stood in neat, orderly rows. As they moved deeper into the city outskirts, the destruction became less abstract and painfully personal. They did not need anyone to describe what had happened. It was written in every fragment of brick, every collapsed roof, every fire-blackened wall. What had once been suburbs with gardens, fences, and clean pavements now resembled landscapes of abandonment. Trees stood, snapped, or burned. Sidewalks had melted into craters. Domestic objects, a scorched stove, a broken sewing machine, a child's metal toy lay scattered as if frozen mid-motion, still holding the imprint of households that no longer existed. Some women slowed their pace without realizing it. The impressions grew stronger with each step. The destruction was no longer something seen from a train window or heard about from others. It surrounded them with a clarity that allowed no denial. Their minds attempted to match what they saw with old images of order and familiarity, but the gaps grew too wide to bridge. When they reached the first residential districts, any remaining hope of finding recognizable structures began to slip away. Rows of apartment buildings that once housed hundreds of families had collapsed inward, leaving open cavities filled with charred debris. Staircases jutted out into empty space. Walls had been reduced to half-height fragments, revealing ashes where rooms had once held furniture, books, framed photographs. The women looked at these openings not as strangers but as former residents of similar homes. Each hollow frame hinted at a life interrupted, a place where morning routines and quiet evenings had been replaced by fire and ruin. Occasionally, among the destruction, stood a solitary wall or doorway. These lonely structures created the illusion that something remained, but they led to nothing, only to the exposed remains of private lives. A women's coat hanger fused to a burned beam. A teacup still intact among shattered tiles. A handful of letters, bleached by sun and rain. The ink almost erased. The group moved further in silence. Even the soldiers guiding them restricted their instructions to gestures, aware that words would provide little comfort in a place where so much had been lost. The women's footsteps slowed as they scanned every corner, searching for patterns, anything that could connect the past to the present. A specific tree in a courtyard, the outline of a cinema that once marked a busy intersection, the curve of a street that had held small shops. But even the streets themselves had been transformed. Bomb craters rewrote the urban layout. Where one road ended, another began abruptly in a cliff of broken stone. Street signs were gone. In their place stood wooden stakes painted with temporary markers. These new paths were the result of emergency reconstruction, not continuity. When the group reached a central district, once the heart of the city, the silence deepened. This place had been a bustling center of commerce, filled with cafes, bakeries, bookstores, and tram stops. Now it was an open field of debris stretching in all directions. Only the bare foundations revealed the shapes of former buildings. Large chimneys lay toppled across the ground like fallen monuments. A clock tower, whose bells had dictated daily rhythms for generations, had collapsed into its own courtyard, its broken metal frame twisted like a sculpture of ruin. Here, the women finally understood what they had not allowed themselves to believe. Their cities had not merely suffered damage. They had been fundamentally erased. Entire neighborhoods no longer existed in any functional form. The places they had imagined returning to, the rooms they believed would shelter them again, had vanished into smoke and rubble long before their release from captivity. Some continued scanning the horizon, perhaps hoping that behind this expanse of devastation, some small section had survived untouched. Others stood still, unable to take another step, their bodies stiffening as though the enormity of loss weighed down their limbs. Even without tears or words, their reactions unfolded in subtle, unmistakable ways. Shoulders that sank, gazes that dropped, breaths that faltered. One woman looked toward the horizon with the rigid posture of someone bracing for impact. Another gripped the strap of her small satchel, as though holding on to the last piece of stability she possessed. Another stared at a ruined foundation for a long time, as if trying to rebuild the walls in her mind, placing each brick as memory insisted it had once been. In that moment, the idea of home shifted irreversibly. It was no longer a place they could walk toward. It had become a memory disconnected from physical reality, a fragile imprint preserved only within themselves. The future they had imagined, stepping back into familiar courtyards, opening doors that creaked the same way as before, collapsed alongside the buildings that once housed those possibilities. Around them, small groups of civilians picked through debris, searching for salvageable materials. A few carried bundles of firewood gathered from broken beams. Others sifted through the rubble with bare hands, hoping to find objects that held personal meaning. These scenes showed the women the path ahead, not a return to stability, but the beginning of reconstruction amid ruins. The soldiers signaled that they had to continue walking. The women obeyed, though many moved as if in a daze. They were no longer returning home. They were stepping into what was left. The final part of the women's return was no longer a journey toward familiar places, but an adjustment to a landscape erased by war. In the days after their arrival, each woman was brought to the area where her home had once stood. Allied and local authorities guided them through districts that lacked street signs, recognizable buildings, or any sense of former order. The destruction was overwhelming. Entire neighborhoods had been burned or leveled, leaving only foundations and scattered fragments of former households. Some women found nothing but a depression filled with bricks and ash. Others discovered partial remnants of walls, staircases, or cellars. In heavily bombed areas, even these traces had vanished. The scenes made clear that their homes had ceased to exist years before their return. The women reacted quietly, but deeply. There were no outbursts, only an inward collapse visible in how they stood, how their shoulders lowered, how their hands gripped small satchels containing their last possessions. The idea of home, the anchor that had carried them through captivity, dissolved in front of them. They were not returning to a place, they were stepping into absence. Local systems attempted to support them, but resources were scarce. Temporary shelters were set up in surviving schools, barracks, and administrative buildings. Civilians lived in makeshift camps built from salvaged materials. The returning women now became part of this fragile post-war network, receiving ration cards, registering for housing, and joining debris-clearing efforts. Their daily routines shifted to the demands of survival, standing in food lines, sorting through ruins for usable items, or assisting in reconstruction tasks. Each fragment uncovered a dish, a toy, a piece of clothing, reminded them of the scale of loss embedded in the rubble. Some searched for relatives or neighbors, following lists marked with crossed-out addresses and uncertain updates. Occasionally, they found someone who recognized a name. More often, they met silence. The loss of home extended beyond physical destruction. It unraveled the connections that once defined their lives. Neighborhoods had scattered, families moved or gone missing, and communities had dissolved into uncertainty. Belonging no longer meant returning to a specific place, but adapting to the shared struggle of rebuilding among ruins. Yet slowly, resilience surfaced. The women learned new routines, found roles in emerging civilian structures, and built small forms of stability through daily tasks. The ruins around them became not just symbols of devastation, but the groundwork for gradual reconstruction. Memory remained painful, but it coexisted with the practical need to move forward. Their collapse upon realizing their homes were gone was not the end of their story. It was the moment they confronted the full cost of war and the beginning of the long process of creating a life from what remained.